When it comes to the future of Final Fantasy, the talking points and anticipation among fans almost always builds up around what sort of setting or story we are likely to see next. As a series that constantly reinvents itself for each instalment, the games run the risk but also have the advantage of upending expectations and conventions for a given entry and evolving away from the traditions and limitations of JRPG gaming with each subsequent game. So what does the series' history tell us about how Final Fantasy reinvents the wheel for setting and story? What might this mean or hint about for a Final Fantasy XVII? And what do invested players personally want to see? Jumping right in, and as many fans know, Final Fantasy emerged from the Tolkien school of fantasy, inspired as it was by D&D, Wizardry, Ultima, and Dragon Quest in its early conception. As such, the foundations of the earliest games relied on classic elements like knights, mages, elves, dragons, and so on. From the outset, these were bridged, and increasingly so as time wore on, with instances of science fiction, and in a very broad, if perhaps reductive sense, we can view each Final Fantasy game as weighted to one or the other in how they blend these genres: swords or guns, castles or space stations, dragons or mechs. And for example, where we might say that Final Fantasy IX has an 80-20 split towards the traditional Tolkien sort of fantasy, Final Fantasy VII may have an 80-20 split in the other direction, in a very broad strokes, reductive sort of sense. Beyond this, we have recurring elements that are particular to Final Fantasy: the use of crystals, the use of summonable beings, the relationship between nature and mankind, are each used to some degree or other through most of these games. And taking summons as just one example, they've evolved from primarily being a battle utility for our characters in the earlier games to actually being our characters in Final Fantasy XVI, and their significance has grown to become a large aspect of these stories that play out. So, taking each of these factors into account and looking at the most recent mainline entry, Final Fantasy XVI, which leaned quite heavily into a medieval European setting, pitched battles, armoured knights, castles, and so on, it may be reasonable to assume that Square are going to move away from this sort of genre and setting in the next mainline game. Perhaps they will shift the dial back towards a more science fiction or hard science sort of scenario, whether that's the dystopian cyberpunk of Final Fantasy VII, the cozy solar punk of Final Fantasy VIII, or the whimsy steampunk of Final Fantasy IX. It remains to be seen. But this is where audience speculations and opinions get quite interesting, because there has long been suggestions and opinions about what sort of setting Final Fantasy should explore next, and those that want Square to push the envelope a little bit more have suggested everything from a full-blown space opera set in outer space to some Atlantis-like underwater setting to something more like Dante's Inferno journeying through some sort of purgatorial setting. And each of these in their own way are interesting takes that do move away a little bit from the common science fantasy settings that we've seen and that Final Fantasy seems to operate in. But I suppose within that, and looking at the threads of commonality that are so essential to defining what Final Fantasy is as an anthology, it would be a case of exploring to what extent crystals are used, if at all, to what extent summons are used, and things like that, within whatever new setting this might be. Are we going to see chocobos in space? Are we going to see Moogles underwater? For my part, I don't personally speculate or mind too much about what a new Final Fantasy setting might be, providing they work well with or in service of a story. And traditionally, Final Fantasy is very good at making setting an aspect of story in how it reflects and folds into key events in either subtle or not so subtle ways. So the corporate villainy of Shinra is reflected in the dystopian, depressed dwellings of the wider world of Gaia. The eternal carnage of sin is reflected in the stagnance of Spira, and so on. Although actually, having said that, the relative coziness and richness of Final Fantasy VIII's world is a personal favourite of mine, and despite the geopolitics and the periodic Lunacry. I think there is something to be said for settings that aren't directly existentially threatened by blights or meteors, and I personally prefer them to the sort of arid dystopias that we get in some games that are quite bleak and not particularly enjoyable to traverse, which is my 2 cents worth there. Moving on to consider future personnel, systems and gameplay of the series, Yoshi-P himself has recently remarked how he'd like the continuity of Final Fantasy to be helmed by a younger development team in future, which is a great point and a very interesting observation. We have shifted over the last 2 decades from a Sakaguchi era to a Kitase era to something that has more recently been juggled between various veterans of the series, and for many players it has often felt like they are not sure what to do with what they've inherited. They are not sure how to deliver something that both suits the business needs of Square and fan expectations. And with most of these veteran guys inching into their 50s and 60s, it's very interesting to consider the next generation of Square director, what they might do, what direction they might take, because where Square alumni would have joined the company as fans of Final Fantasy I, Final Fantasy II, Final Fantasy III, we are now seeing staff emerging who joined the company as fans of Final Fantasy VII, Final Fantasy VIII, Final Fantasy IX, and so the dial may well shift, for good or ill, in an entirely new direction for the series, based on the lived experience, the ambitions, the memories and the impressions of the series from a younger, fresher team. Regarding systems design and gameplay, it's pretty well established that Final Fantasy is on an action-orientated trajectory. Final Fantasies 15, 16 and the 7 Remake series have each iterated on action gameplay in their own way. For my part, I'm okay with it. I think the main cornerstone of Final Fantasy as a story and as a gameplay experience is the fellowship aspect. So where they took the party system with Final Fantasy VII Remake and Rebirth, I would hope that they go more in that direction and pursue that over the automated or AI-controlled party members that they had in Final Fantasy XVI. The only real negative in the newer games in terms of the focus on action is the diminished relevance and utilisation of magic, which is basically, in my opinion, kind of rubbish and obsolete in most of these recent entries that are very much focused, I think, and geared towards the hack and slash melee sort of battle systems. Regarding the history and traditions of the series, there has also long been calls to return to the turn-based roots of the games, which I understand, I appreciate where that's coming from as a veteran player and as someone that loves the golden era of the series, as it's so called. And actually I've recently been playing Fantasian, which I love, and it's amazing to see how turn-based games can still uniquely be iterated upon and developed and improved in modern gaming. That being said, I would honestly be surprised if Square ventured to make a mainline Final Fantasy game turn-based again. I can't see it happening, but I do think they should be looking at making smaller spin-off games that cater to that market, developing games not dissimilar to Fantasian in-house. I really feel that would be an easy business win, and there is a market for it, in my opinion. Finally, some slightly more subjective random notes from me are, firstly, I think the villain matters. And regardless of what the setting looks like or whatever for Final Fantasy XVII, I think the villain needs real consideration. Many stories, I think, make or break on a villain. Many fantasy adventures are only as strong as the villain that you are up against. And I think Ultima from Final Fantasy XVI is a great example of this not particularly working well. I think Ultima fell flat for a lot of players in an otherwise pretty good, quite strong entry. Many players have also called for Square to bring another female hero into the series, with Lightning and the tech demo hero Agni being the only real nods or efforts towards this. Personally, I'm on board with that. I think as long as the character arc and the development is there, organically done. But personally, as a big fan of villains, I would love to see a central female antagonist, and Benedicta playing Final Fantasy XVI really reminded me of this, or made me think about this, because Benedicta was a brilliant character, but of course she was only a temporary, tertiary sort of tragic villain in 16, and I really think they could take a character like that and run with it and have her develop over a full game. So potential female central villain for a new Final Fantasy game would be great. And beyond that, again, subjective personal point, I do wonder whether they could dial back on the summons being a central aspect of story. Not saying I dislike them, I think they're very important, they are an awesome aspect of the anthology, and a cornerstone of the games. But to date we have had summons as an increasingly central part of the story. We've had a summoner's journey to some degree or another pretty much since Final Fantasy IX. We've had the summons as gods in Final Fantasy XV, we've had them as nation-state weapon characters in Final Fantasy XVI, and it'd be interesting for me, I think, if we could set them more to one side like they are in the Final Fantasy VII anthology, like they were in Final Fantasy VIII, and have them kind of supporting a story that is focused on something else entirely. Aside from that, I'm pretty easy, as long as Final Fantasy XVII gives me some compelling characters thrown together in a fellowship, some interesting obstacles to overcome, personal dilemmas to explore. I'm pretty sure I'm going to be there for it. But I would love to know your thoughts and feelings about what you would like to see from a new Final Fantasy game. I'm always keen to get other impressions and opinions from the fandom, because Final Fantasy is so rich and diverse in the sort of people that play it and what they personally take and like to see in these stories. So hit me up in the comments, let me know what you would like to see in a Final Fantasy XVII. Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed the episode, please consider joining me on Patreon. Alternatively, if you feel like donating me a coffee, you can do so, the links are available below.